So they took this book, they bound it together, and then they sold each book for $100 in 1893, which is the equivalent of over like $2,500 nowadays. You think about this, Andrew Carnegie at the time was the richest man in the world. He could have written a check and sent it to the Authors Club and fund the whole thing for 1,000 years in the future had he wanted to. But instead, they thought, look, how can we use our minds? How can we create an asset that'll pay for this? Hey, I'm Russell Brunson, and today I want to show you guys one of the coolest old books I've ever found during my collecting. And inside this book, there's a business lesson. The book is called Liber Scriptorum. This is one of the coolest books inside of my collection because of the story, but also because of the business lesson I'm going to show you guys here in a minute. But this copy right here was published in 1893. And kind of the story behind it, there's a club called the Authors Club, and you can see this, the name of it right here. And the Authors Club was a club for aspiring young authors, and they had all these established authors, some of the greatest of all time, who were teaching and training these guys. In 1891, they had an idea to raise money for this club. And so what they did is they took all of the best authors, and they had every single author write one chapter inside of this book. And so they wrote all these different chapters, and then they put them together and they bound them in this book, and every author had to sign their copy of it. Okay, they only printed, I believe, 251 of these. In fact, let me double check inside here. They printed 251 copies. 251 copies. This is number 148. And the author had signed all 250 copies of their article, and it was bound here inside this book. Now, some of the authors who their work is inside here, you may have heard of them, like Mark Twain, Theodore Roosevelt, Andrew Carnegie, and a whole bunch of other amazing people were all found here inside this book. So they took this book, they bound it together, and then they sold each book for $100 in 1893, which is the equivalent of over like $2,500 nowadays, which is kind of crazy. And they used that to raise a whole bunch of money to go and fund the Authors Club. Now, I'm going to show you guys inside this book, and then when we come back, I'm going to teach you guys a lesson on how you can use inside your business to raise a lot of money very, very quickly. So come check this out. I actually have two copies of it, as you can see here. These are two of the original copies, and then I found one that they republished a few years later. This is book number 2, basically. And if you look at this one right here is book number 148 out of 251. And this one over here is book number 67 of 251. And you see again, it's called the Authors Club. And each of these different authors, many of who you would know their names, they each wrote an article. There's Andrew Carnegie's. Their handwriting's so fancy back then, it's sometimes kind of hard to read them all. But these are all the different authors who added to it. Samuel Clemens. So here's Genius Illustrated from Burns. So here's the article that Andrew Carnegie wrote inside of here. And when they wrote these, the rule was they could never publish this anywhere else. So it had to be unique to this book, never published anywhere else. And then each author had to sign all 251 copies. So that's got Andrew Carnegie's signature right there. Again, along with every other author who wrote in here that's got their individual, like actual signatures as well, which is why this book is so cool and so unique. All right, so what's the business lesson from the Liber Scriptorum? You think about this, Andrew Carnegie at the time was the richest man in the world. He could have written a check and sent it to the Authors Club and fund the whole thing for 1,000 years in the future had he wanted to. But instead, they thought, look, how can we use our minds? How can we create an asset that'll pay for this, right? And so the idea they came up with was the very first ever anthology book. Now, you may have heard of anthology books nowadays. There's a lot of people who teach this concept, who do this concept. What they did is when they got these authors, made this mastermind group together, each wrote an article, each signed it, they bound in this book, only sold 251 copies of it at $100 a piece to raise all the money to fund the Authors Club, which is so cool. So how can you do something similar in your business? That's the question, right? And that's what an anthology book is. You've probably seen these before. In fact, the first anthology books I was ever aware of myself was the Chicken Soup for the Soul books. You may have heard those books before. Mark Victor Hansen sold like 25 billion copies of these books. But he would go and he'd find a niche, he'd find a market, right? And he'd have all these people go like Chicken Soup for the Horse Lover Soul. Every market had a Chicken Soup for the Soul book, right? You'd find 20, 40, 50 authors in that genre, and they each write an article, they put it into a book, and they launch the book together, right? And what's cool is these authors who had a chance to put a chapter, a lot of them, it was the first time they'd ever been published authors. They could say, this is my book. They had an incentive to go and sell the book as well, but they became part of the book, right? But for someone who's putting together an anthology book, right? For this one, the Authors Club is putting together this thing to raise funds. You can do the same thing inside your market, right? Find 5 or 10 or 20 other people who are in your market, have everyone write a chapter, and they can pay you to be in the chapter. You can co-publish, co-launch the book. There's a whole bunch of really powerful strategies. In fact, the one that we did a couple of years ago when we first launched ClickFunnels, I was like, how could I take this concept? How could I create an anthology book that would help get our message out to the world? And I could have sold, I could have had people pay me to put a chapter in, but instead what I did is I wanted to find the right people. So I went through, and at the time I think we had 79 people who had won a Two Comma Club award. So I sent all of them a letter. I was like, hey, you won a Two Comma Club award. Would you be willing to write a chapter in a book I'm creating called 30 Days? And I emailed all 79 people, and from that, 30 people messaged back, said, yes, I would do that. And so each person wrote a chapter. And I had them each base their chapter on a question. So the question was like, if you were to lose everything today, you lost your money, you lost your income, you lost everything. All you had was a ClickFunnels account for 30 days, and you had to get back on top. What would you do from day number 1 to day 30 to get back on top? And so each author in our book had to write, day number 1, I would do this. Day number 2, I would do that. And so everyone wrote, one day what they would do. And then we took all those chapters, combined them in a book. I wrote the foreword for the book, and then we published it, we launched it, and that was it. And from that day forward, that book has sold tens of thousands of copies. It's made us insane amounts of money. And it was just an anthology book, just like Liber Scriptorum as was to raise money for the Authors Club. For us, it was a way to get more people into ClickFunnels. And so think about this in your business. Like, what could you do? Could you create some kind of anthology book where you get people in your market, gather them together, have everyone write a chapter? And again, you can sell chapters. I've seen people sell chapters anywhere from $1,000 to $10,000 to be able to be included inside the book. So imagine you get 20 or 30 people each to contribute a chapter. Each person pays you $1,000 or $2,000 to be in the book, right? That's some good money you can make up front from the book, and now you have this tool that you can then use to sell. You can leverage other people's credibility, their names, their stories inside the book as well. So anyway, I want to show you this because number one, this is one of my favorite books in my collection. It means a lot to me. It's signed by some of my favorite authors of all time. But number two, I thought it was such a really powerful business lesson for any of you guys who are trying to sell more stuff online. Think about creating an anthology book inside your market to get the greatest thought leaders to contribute to something great you're creating, and then you can use that book as a free plus shipping book. You can use it as a lead magnet. You can use it as so many different ways, so many ways to monetize something like this. All right, if you like this content, you're gonna love this video right here.